Contact! Sector 4! The words shot through the bridge like a blade, cutting through the tension thick as iron. Draven didn't ask for details. He saw them himself. A flickering array of movement on the laser plasma display. Red markers surging fast. Vraxian warships. 4 interceptors, 1 battlecruiser. Lieutenant Vaith confirmed. Voice sharp as a whetted blade. ETA 60 seconds. They're moving to intercept. Let them. Aros didn't shift. Didn't blink. His pulse stayed even, his focus locked on the enemy ships carving through the void. They had no idea they were already dead. The Vigilant Apex remained still, its displacement armor phasing in and out of visible spectrum, warping space around it. To the Vrax, it was nothing but background radiation, a whisper in the dark. They had no idea humanity had learned to turn whispers into war cries. Bring weapons online, target the first 2 interceptors. Disable the third. Let the battlecruiser think it has a chance, Aros ordered. They believe we're retreating, Vaith said, glancing at the enemy formation. They believe we're prey. No one spoke after that. Commands were unnecessary. The Apex moved like a thought, silent, unseen, inevitable. The Vraxian interceptors split formation, closing the distance with a hunter's arrogance. Their angular hulls gleamed under the fractured glow of a distant star, the blue sheen of their plasma coils pulsing in rhythmic beats, like a predator licking its lips. Their last mistake. Aros lifted his chin slightly, the only indication of his order. The Apex struck. Gravity lances licked out from concealed ports, carving through shields like molten razors. The first interceptor folded inward, as if the universe had clenched a fist around it. Metal curled, bodies vaporized. Nothing remained but debris drifting like the bones of forgotten war machines. The second ship veered off, engines burning hot in a last-ditch maneuver. Too late. A void shear cannon burst through its side, exposing the cockpit to the black. The pilot didn't even have time to scream. The third interceptor jerked violently, systems flickering, controls failing. It wasn't destroyed, but it was crippled. And crippled things served a purpose. The battlecruiser surged forward, its deflector barriers pulsing like a heartbeat. They'd been waiting for this, expecting a wounded creature. They thought the kill would be easy. Aros bared his teeth. Vaith! Scramble their sensors. Feed them a ghost. A heartbeat later, the Apex vanished. Not in the way a ship should disappear, not with a simple cloaking field or a phase jump. It ceased to exist on every Vraxian scanner, its signal shredded into 1,000 false echoes. The battlecruiser hesitated. Aros did not. Now! The Apex reappeared above them, inverted, primed. A single breath. A singularity charge unleashed with the fury of a collapsed star. For a moment the universe hesitated. Then the battlecruiser buckled, twisted, then collapsed inward, crushed by the weight of its own existence. A final flicker of golden light. Then silence. Nothing remained. The battlefield belonged to the dead. Aros exhaled slowly, feeling the weight in his chest lift, just slightly. Transmit the message. Vaith complied. The fractured interceptor, still limping through the void, received the transmission. Its dying systems barely had time to process it before the Apex snapped its engines in half with a final, merciful plasma burst. Let it crawl home. Let them see what had happened here. Strategist Vox stared at the display, unblinking. The feed flickered, the last transmission from the wreckage, looping the same impossible moments. An entire battle group erased. Not over hours, not over days, in minutes. This is impossible, murmured tactician Veshka Ryul, her golden eyes narrowing. They shouldn't have this level of weaponry. They shouldn't exist at all. Zirin's voice was a quiet snarl. The last human war had ended with their screams echoing across the stars. Or so the Dominion had believed. But the truth was there, laid bare in the carnage. They didn't just survive, Zirin murmured, watching the human warship shift and move like a living thing. They evolved. He flicked through the data streams, searching for anything, any sign of weakness, any flaw in their tactics, anything that made sense. There was nothing. Tell me I'm wrong, Zirin, Veshka said quietly. Tell me they aren't coming back. Zirin felt something in his gut twist. Not strategy, not pride. Something older, something more primal, a memory of predators in the dark. They never left. The command chamber felt colder now, the light from the displays casting long, uneasy shadows against the walls. Humanity was supposed to be a cautionary tale, a dead empire, a ruin of history. And yet, here they were, not just alive, but hunting. Send word to the High Council, Zirin ordered. Tell them the ghosts of Earth have returned. His voice dropped lower, a whisper of something ancient and true. And they are not merciful. Deep beneath Karin III, buried in rock and shadow, Kezran Othak stood before the assembled War Council. Data streamed across the heads-up displays, battle reports, intercepted transmissions, tactical projections. The Vrax had received their message. The clock had started. Marshal Varen Dask exhaled, slow and measured. They know. Let them. Aro stood, the weight of 50 years pressing against his shoulders. But now, it wasn't a burden. It was a weapon. They took everything from us. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It carried the force of every buried city, every scorched home, every last echo of the old world before it burned. Now, they would make the galaxy remember. We take everything back. The air inside the vault carried a weight beyond gravity, a silence thick with the unspoken. Drevan Aro stood at the center of it, watching the battle playback flicker across the laser plasma display. The wreckage of the Vraxian fleet hung like shattered bones, their vessels split apart, gutted from the inside like prey left half-eaten in the dark. They had underestimated humanity. Now they knew better. Marshal Varen Dask broke the silence first, his voice as steady as the cold steel of a drawn blade. They'll retaliate. He studied the display as if searching for any missed detail, any thread left loose in the weave of war. Fast, hard. They'll want to snuff us out before the rest of the Dominion realizes what's happened. Aros let the words settle before answering. Then we make sure the first blow isn't the last thing they remember. We give them something they can't erase. His fingers traced a command into his gauntlet, sending encrypted orders through the neural link. The Apex's strike had been a whisper of what humanity was capable of. The next move would leave scars. Lieutenant Fail Vaith, leaning against the console's edge, smirked. So, we're making sure their nightmares have our names on them? Aros met his gaze. Not just their nightmares, their history. The overhead lighting flickered as the vault shifted its orbit, its hidden thrusters firing in silence, adjusting the station's alignment with the next target. A fleet had already begun mobilizing, silent, unseen, moving like a predator slipping between reeds. Apex had been the opening cut. Now came the deeper wound. The transmission feed crackled to life, pulling their attention to the War Council chamber. Admiral Kezran Othak's figure emerged against the heads-up display, his silhouette a stark contrast against the dark hues of the command center behind him. The Dominion has responded, he said, voice devoid of surprise. Vrax High Command is moving to retaliate. They've dispatched 3 full battalions to hunt us down. Vaith let out a low exhale, shaking his head. They never learn. Othak's mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. They think they're the ones doing the hunting. Aros turned back to the data streams cascading across the display. Their movements were predictable, drawn by instinct rather than strategy. The Vrax had always fought with blunt force, overwhelming enemies through sheer numbers, brute efficiency. It had worked against weaker forces. It had never been tested against something that could outthink them. He keyed in a command, shifting the display to the next phase of their operation. A planet appeared in the feed. Drovac 4, one of the Dominion's primary military outposts, nestled in the orbit of a dying sun. A fortress world heavily fortified, the perfect place to remind them that humanity no longer played by the old rules. We'll strike before they're ready, Aros said, the edges of his words carrying something sharp, something final. They expect a fight in deep space. We take it to their doorstep instead. The council chamber shifted with murmurs, brief, Approving nods exchanged between commanders. Dask leaned forward slightly, arms crossed. They'll never expect an assault on Drovac, but that's because it's suicide to take a fleet directly into its defense grid. Not if the fleet never arrives the way they expect, Aros countered. He tapped the panel, shifting the strategy map, adjusting their approach vectors. We don't attack from orbit. We fold in beneath the planetary shield, phase shifted, using the gravity well itself to mask our approach. By the time their defense systems register our presence, we'll be in their skies, inside their fortifications. Vaith let out a sharp breath of laughter. They'll shit themselves. Othak's gaze lingered on the projections, on the shifting probabilities. He gave a slight nod. It's risky. It's necessary, Aros corrected. Dask studied the display for another long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, the slow weight of approval settling over his features. Then we do it right. I'll have the assault teams prepped. You're leading the strike. Aros inclined his head. Wouldn't trust anyone else to carve the first wound. The council dispersed, each commander peeling off to finalize their respective roles in the attack. Aros remained, watching as the battle projection unfolded, a cold certainty settling into his bones. He had waited years for this moment, for the chance to bring war back to the ones who had written humanity off as dust. And the next time the Dominion looked to the stars, it wouldn't be in conquest. It would be in fear. The first strike team departed the vault in silence, their ships slipping through the folds of subspace, unreadable to any conventional tracking systems. The Apex led the charge, its displacement armor flickering as it danced along the event horizon of the designated jump point. They would emerge below the enemy's planetary defense grid, folding into the air like phantoms breaching a temple. Inside the Apex, Aros stood at the helm, eyes locked on the heads-up display as their destination grew closer. The pressure in the cabin shifted slightly as the artificial gravity adjusted to the incoming transition. Vaith checked his rifle, the polished black plating catching the low light. How many do you think will make it to the ground before they realize what's happening? Aros didn't glance away from the display. Not enough. The ship's alert signaled the final approach. Aros tightened his grip against the armrest, the thrumming energy of the transition curling around them like the edge of a storm waiting to break. The Apex cut through the threshold like a blade slipping through fabric. The world beneath them snapped into view. Drovac 4, its surface covered in titanium bastions, shielded cities, artillery silos poised toward the sky. The Dominion's fortress world, a symbol of their power. They never saw it coming. The Apex punched through the upper atmosphere, its silent war engine dispersing the pressure around it, masking its descent until the last possible moment. The first tremors of recognition rippled through the enemy defense grid. Warning sirens erupted across the citadel as the human fleet materialized from nothingness, descending upon the stronghold like the hand of something ancient, something owed vengeance. Shockwaves followed in their wake. Arrows stood as the dropship doors slid open, revealing the city below, the flashing red strobes of alarms casting long shadows across the steel-plated streets. Vaith loaded his weapon. They don't even have time to be afraid. Arrows stepped forward, the gravity of the descent pulling at his limbs, the weight of the coming storm settling into his bones. They will. The ground forces landed, and Drovac 4 became the first world to learn what it meant when ghosts returned to settle the score. The air inside the command drop pod was thick with anticipation, the kind that made silence feel heavier than spoken words. Drevan stood at the open hatch, eyes locked onto Drovac 4's surface, a machine world built for war. The sky above was a riot of movement, streaks of incoming fire arcing toward the landing fleets, tracer rounds slicing through the clouds like burning knives. In the distance, the Dominion's planetary defense grid shuddered to life, its orbital turrets aligning with mechanical lethality. He checked the heads-up display embedded in his visor, calculating the battlefield before a single shot had been fired. Humanity had landed. Now it was time to carve the message into their cities. A coded transmission flickered across the display. Marshal Varen Dask. Ground assault was in motion. Drop teams are in position. Dask's voice carried over the encrypted channel, low and weighted with the brutal efficiency of a man who had spent his life planning war. Their defenses are adjusting faster than projected, but they're prioritizing outer sectors. They don't realize the main strike is coming from within their own city. Aros barely blinked. Then we don't give them time to realize. Vaith shifted beside him, boots steady against the platform. They must be asking themselves how we got past their orbitals, how a fleet materialized in their skies without setting off a single early warning. Aros didn't need to wonder what the enemy was thinking. He already knew. They were scrambling, grasping for explanations, believing for a fraction of a second that their systems had failed, that a glitch had made them blind. But there was no failure, no glitch, only the slow realization that they had never been in control. First wave is making contact, Dask reported, breaking through the static-laced feed. Drovac's command grid is still scrambling for tactical cohesion. We hit their core relay within the next 15 minutes, and they lose planetary coordination. Aros pulled the latch beside him, stepping onto the extended rail of the drop pod as it skimmed low over the sector's skyline. Below, Dominion forces flooded the streets like veins of liquid metal, their armor reflecting the neon slashes of warning sirens. They were organizing fast. Not fast enough. "Deploy," Aros ordered. The drop pod's release clamps hissed apart, sending the strike team into freefall. The first moment was silence, the unnatural kind that came before speed could register, before air resistance could scream against the armor plating. Then came the rush, gravity tearing them downward, the city rising to meet them in a blur of black and crimson lights. Aros landed first. The impact cracked through the pavement, metal-plated boots slamming onto reinforced alloy. He rolled forward, rifle already snapping into position, targeting grid flaring against his visor. The Dominion infantry hadn't even turned to face him before the first shot burned through their ranks. His team followed, a dozen shadows colliding with the battlefield, spreading through the streets like silent specters. Gunfire flared from rooftops, barricades came to life with defensive charges, and the once-structured city of Drovac 4 erupted into chaos. Vaith moved alongside him, his sidearm barking a sharp retort as Dominion foot soldiers crumpled, their bodies still twitching from the neural disruption rounds. "We need to clear this sector fast. They're adapting." "They're panicking," Aros corrected. A Dominion officer sprinted into view, barking orders into his communicator. His body jerked as a sniper round split through his skull, sending him staggering backward like a marionette with its strings cut. Aros didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. He advanced. The assault team pushed through, sweeping past the remnants of frontline defenses, moving deeper into the heart of Drovac's tactical grid. They weren't here for territory. They weren't here for symbolic victories. They were here to cut the Dominion's throat and let them watch themselves bleed out. Vaith's voice crackled over comms. "Satellite control station is up ahead. If we take it, they lose long-range artillery targeting for the next 20 minutes. Aros didn't need convincing. He adjusted course, his squad following in lethal precision, moving like a single entity. The building loomed ahead, a massive structure pulsing with energy conduits, Dominion banners hanging in defiance against the sky. Automated turrets snapped toward them, but they were already too late. Aros sprinted ahead, sliding into cover as the first plasma round hissed past his shoulder. "Override the turret grid," he commanded. Kivos Ron, their infiltration specialist, was already moving, his gloved fingers dancing over the interface, feeding it false data. The turrets twitched, hesitated, then realigned, turning on their own troops. The courtyard erupted in fire and metal. Aros seized the opening. They moved as one, sweeping into the facility, cutting through resistance with the efficiency of an executioner's blade. Dominion soldiers fell before they could fire. The screams of their officers drowned beneath the sound of systems crashing, defenses crumbling. The control station's core flickered, its mainframe overloading as Kivos rewrote its parameters. Drovac's artillery grid went blind. Vaith exhaled, adjusting his rifle. "That's one artery severed." Aros didn't celebrate. "Now we go for the heart." Before the words had even left his mouth, an alert flashed across his visor, a Dominion override signal pulsing through the remaining city defenses. Varen Dask's voice slammed into the channel. "We've got a problem. Dominion High Command just authorized planetary lockdown. They're cutting the city off from external reinforcements, but they're also sealing us in." Aros's jaw clenched. This wasn't desperation. This was something planned. "Do they have a counter-strategy in motion?" Vaith asked, reloading his weapon. "Not yet," Dask replied, "but this isn't just a standard lockdown. They're isolating sectors, sectioning us off. Something's coming." Aros's gut twisted, but not in fear, in recognition. He had seen this kind of maneuver before, not from the Dominion, not from the Vrax, but from humanity. And if the Dominion was copying human warfare doctrine, it meant they had been studying them longer than expected. Aros switched comm channels. "Kezran, what's the Dominion's latest transmission activity?" The Admiral's response was immediate. "Encrypted fleet movement orders. They're mobilizing something outside of Drovac 4, but we haven't cracked their code yet." "They're not trying to win this battle," Aros realized aloud. His blood turned colder, his focus sharpening into something lethal. "Then what are they doing?" Dask asked. Aros didn't answer immediately. He just watched the city around him shift, its defenses bending inward, the battlefield reshaping itself. And for the first time since the war had started, he felt it. The Dominion wasn't fighting to defend Drovac. They were preparing for something else. And whatever it was, it hadn't arrived yet. Drevan Aros had learned to trust instinct. Not the reactionary kind that panicked under fire, but the deep-rooted awareness that came from years of knowing when a battlefield was lying to you. Right now, the entire city of Drovac 4 was screaming a lie. The enemy was adapting too quickly, not in the frantic way of a force caught off guard, but in a manner that suggested foresight. This wasn't just an evolving countermeasure, it was an anticipated trap. He swept his gaze across the heads-up display inside his visor, absorbing the tactical readouts. Streets were rerouting traffic, artificial barriers shifting to funnel movement into tighter avenues. The city itself was closing in around them. A static pulse from his comm link cut through the chatter. Marshal Varen Dask's voice followed, clipped and severe. "We cracked part of their encrypted network. They didn't just seal this city to keep us inside. They're locking us in position." Aros flexed his fingers against the grip of his rifle. "They're forcing us to hold ground for something bigger." "They've been studying us," Dask confirmed, "longer than we realized." Aros exhaled, the weight of it barely audible. If the Dominion was replicating human war doctrine, they'd calculated for contingencies, which meant the real fight hadn't even started yet. Vaith's voice broke through next, dry as ever. "The good news is we're important enough for them to copy. The bad news is they're using that knowledge to kill us." "They haven't won yet," Aros muttered, watching the city shift its defenses again. "But I want to know what they're preparing for." A new signal flared across the fleet's encrypted comms, a classified priority code from Admiral Kezran Othak. "Fleet recon intercepted an outgoing transmission," Othak said, his voice like steel grating over stone. "It was on a Dominion diplomatic channel, not a military one." Aros frowned. "Meaning?" Othak's next words made his blood turn colder. "They called for reinforcements outside the Dominion." Silence settled for half a breath before Vaith exhaled sharply. "You're telling me they're willing to bring in a foreign fleet just to crush us?" Dask's tone was unreadable. "Desperation makes strange bedfellows. If they sent for allies, it means they either don't trust their own forces to hold us, or they don't intend to fight alone." Aros finished. The implications rippled outward. The Dominion wasn't just playing defense anymore. They were orchestrating something larger. Aros's visor flared with movement. Incoming Dominion units reorganized into specialized attack columns, adjusting their strategy in real time. The battlefield was no longer chaotic. It was controlled. A pattern emerged in their movements, a choreography meant to distract and delay. "They're buying time," Aros realized. Vaith cursed under his breath. For what? A low tremor pulsed beneath them, deep, distant, as if something was shifting beneath the planet's surface. Aros turned sharply, scanning the battlefield. No active artillery strikes, no orbital bombardments. The Dominion wasn't firing from above. "They're not stalling for reinforcements," Aros said, his voice dropping. "They're waiting for something here." Another tremor, louder. The ground beneath their boots vibrated in a slow, pulsing rhythm, like the heartbeat of something waking up. Dask's voice darkened. "We need to move, now." Aros was already signaling for extraction, but the enemy had calculated for this too. "Hostile air defenses just reactivated," Vaith warned. "We're boxed in, no clear evac route." "Then we make one," Aros growled. He swept his rifle toward the nearest barricade, triggering an anti-matter pulse round that detonated the fortified structure into shrapnel and fire. Smoke billowed into the air, swallowing the immediate area in thick, curling waves. "Fall back to Rally Point Theta," Aros ordered, keeping his fire controlled, methodical. "We regroup and push toward exfil," Dask's signal confirmed. "I'll have ground teams clear a path, but we're not leaving without figuring out what they're hiding." The tremors intensified. The city itself was reacting to something. Aros adjusted his visor, rerouting the scanner frequencies, searching beyond conventional energy readings. He bypassed thermal imaging, infrared, electromagnetic scans. There, a frequency spike deep below the surface. Not seismic activity, something artificial. Vaith had seen it too. "That's a power signature, something big." Aros didn't waste time on speculation. "Relay this to Othak. If they've been planning this long, they won't stop with us. They'll use whatever this is against the rest of the fleet." Dask's voice came through, tight with urgency. "New development. Dominion ships are pulling away from our outer assault lines. They're leaving sectors open." Aros froze. "They're abandoning defenses?" "Not abandoning," Dask corrected. "Redirecting." Understanding locked into place like a vice around his ribs. "They're not just using something against us," Aros murmured. "They're unleashing it on the battlefield." The next tremor wasn't beneath them. It came from above. A shadow cut across the sky. A Dominion dreadnought descending from high orbit, its hull carved with unfamiliar markings. It wasn't a standard Dominion warship. It was something older. Vaith's voice was tight. "We're about to meet whoever answered their call." The Dominion hadn't just called for reinforcements. They had woken something up, and it had just arrived. The sky fractured. A ship unlike anything seen before breached the upper atmosphere, its hull dark as the void between stars, covered in undulating layers of shifting metal. The Dominion fleet had given it space to descend, parting their formation as if making room for something they feared as much as they revered. It wasn't one of theirs. Draven Aros stared at the monstrous vessel as his visor adjusted, analyzing its structure. It had no visible weapon systems, no thermal output, no ion trails, yet it moved as if gravity itself bent to its will. Energy signatures pulsed along its hull, shifting wavelengths in unpredictable sequences. It was ancient, but not abandoned. Whatever was inside wasn't just coming to observe. It was coming to join the slaughter. "New target," Vaith muttered, his voice lacking its usual dry edge. "We're gonna need bigger guns." "Not yet," Aros replied, forcing himself to think past instinct. "This isn't an attack. Not yet." The Dominion had orchestrated this moment. They had been waiting for this arrival. If Aros struck first, he risked setting off something he didn't yet understand. A single transmission pulsed from the Dominion flagship toward the descending dreadnought. Not in standard military code, not in Dominion dialect. Aros switched his audio feed, isolating the signal. The language was guttural, layered in harmonics that felt like an intrusion into his mind rather than a sound his ears could process. The dreadnought responded. A deep, resonant vibration spread across the battlefield. Not a sound, but a presence, like pressure against bone, a weight behind the eyes. Several Dominion officers on the open channels gasped, some outright collapsed. Vaith took a half-step back, his face twitching as he resisted the sensation. "That's not communication. That's something else." Aros clenched his fists. "That's control. The Dominion troops didn't react in fear. They straightened, regained their footing. Their body language shifted, more rigid, more synchronized. Their commanders no longer barked orders. They didn't need to. Something had linked them. Dask's voice cut in through the encrypted line, his tone sharpened to a blade's edge. "Something's wrong. Our recon teams are reporting Dominion soldiers moving in absolute unison. Their pulse readings are identical. They're acting like a single entity." The realization settled like ice in Aros's gut. The Dominion hadn't called for reinforcements. They had surrendered themselves to something else. A deep tremor rolled through the city. Not from the ground, from the soldiers. Aros switched to biometric readings, scanning the Dominion infantry still positioned across the ruined skyline. Their vitals were synchronizing, not as individuals, but as parts of a singular whole. He turned sharply. "Othak, tell me you're seeing this." The Admiral's voice was clipped, strained. "Reading it now. Dominion personnel are displaying neural alignment. Their cognitive functions are being overridden." "By what?" "Unknown." That word carried too much weight. The Dominion was powerful, but they had never been this disciplined, never this eerily coordinated. It was no longer a battle against soldiers. It was a battle against something puppeteering them. Aros shifted his stance, calculating his options. The dreadnought loomed above, its unnatural presence pulling at the edges of perception. His fleet could bombard it, but without understanding its defenses, it could be a wasted effort. Then the first Dominion soldier moved, not by choice. His body lurched forward in a rigid, unnatural step. Then another. Then another. It was happening across the battlefield. Troopers staggered, their movements no longer fluid, their limbs obeying something beyond their own minds. "They're not controlling them." Vaith's voice was quiet, horrified. "They're converting them." A soldier near the plaza twitched violently, and then his armor began to shift, warping, fusing with something invisible. His flesh burned away, leaving behind a sleek, metallic exoskeleton that pulsed in time with the dreadnought's strange energy. His head tilted toward Aros. No recognition, no individual will. Dask's voice came in hot. "Confirmed. They're integrating something into their bodies. We need to pull back." Aros barely heard him. He was already moving. "Fall back to secondary positions," he ordered. "No direct engagement. We need to break their synchronization before they overwhelm our line." "How the hell do we break something we don't understand?" Vaith snapped, firing a shot at one of the advancing figures. The projectile struck true, but the Dominion soldier didn't react, didn't even flinch. "Disrupt the link," Aros said. "Whatever's binding them, it has a source." His visor flared with new data as Othak rerouted scans toward the dreadnought's structure, reading a pulse signal emanating from the core of that ship. "It's not just broadcasting, it's rewriting." Aros made a decision. "Then we cut the transmission." Dask swore. "You're talking about a direct infiltration. You want to board that?" Aros reloaded his weapon, turning toward the Apex's landing zone. "It's not a matter of want. It's a matter of necessity." He took one last glance at the battlefield. The Dominion wasn't losing itself. It was becoming something new. And if humanity didn't stop it, this wouldn't be a war. He raised his weapon. The soldier turned its head. The voice that came from it wasn't human. It wasn't Dominion. "You are late." Kivos fired first. The shot struck center mass. The impact rippled through the fused form but didn't kill it. It just spread. The entire wall convulsed. Aros reacted on instinct. "Fall back." Too late. The ship responded. The walls peeled apart, revealing more figures buried beneath the surface, each one blinking awake in perfect unison. Their movements weren't staggered, weren't mechanical. They were deliberate, a single organism reanimating its parts. Aros fired, the kinetic blast tearing through the first figure's skull. It barely staggered before the wound closed, the material weaving itself back together. "Not good," Vaith muttered. "Less talking," Aros snapped, planting an explosive charge against the nearest wall. "More breaking shit." Kivos was already working on an override panel, fingers moving faster than conscious thought. "Whatever's running this place, it's rewriting its own security in real time. I can't break through manually." Then we find the core and rip it apart, Arrow said, priming his detonator. The floor trembled. The ship had heard him. From deep within the structure, something stirred. A new voice filled the space. Not from the figures, not from comms, but from every surface at once. We are awake. The charge exploded. The corridor buckled, collapsed inward, forcing the squad forward. They ran. Behind them, the ship sealed the path, closing off every retreat. Aros didn't stop. He didn't need to. They weren't here to escape. They were here to kill a god before it finished waking up. Drevan Aros didn't slow. The corridor behind them had sealed like the closing throat of some ancient beast, swallowing the path they had come from. There was no turning back. Every step forward was a gamble against the unknown, but standing still meant being absorbed into whatever horror was waiting to be born inside the ship. "Status!" he barked, keeping his rifle raised as they moved. Kivos Ron was already wired into the neural interface on his gauntlet, his eyes flickering as he mapped the shifting pathways through the ship's architecture. "There's no static structure. The corridors are adapting to our movement." He adjusted the settings, recalibrating. "But it's not random. The ship is guiding us somewhere." "That's comforting," Vaith muttered. "Hate when the meal gets to pick the plate." Aros ignored him. The walls pulsed in slow, rhythmic movements, the same cadence as the unreadable signals still flooding Dominion comms. The ship was alive, but more than that, it was listening, and it was learning. Dask's voice crackled through the secured line, barely cutting through the interference. "You're close to the core. Our scans can't penetrate it directly, but whatever's fueling that thing, it's generating an energy field we haven't seen before." Eros exchanged a glance with Kivos. "How much resistance between here and the target?" The infiltrator's brows knit together as he scanned the feed. "Hard to say. The soldiers we encountered earlier, if they were its first attempt at adapting biological matter, it's refining the process as we speak." Vaith shook his head. "You're telling me this thing is workshopping its own troops mid-battle?" Aros clenched his jaw. "That means the longer we wait, the stronger they get." "Then we move now," Dask confirmed. "You have one shot at shutting this thing down. Make it count." Aros was already on the move. The corridor ahead began shifting, walls pulling inward like muscles contracting, narrowing the space, forcing them to squeeze through an opening that hadn't been there seconds ago. They stepped into a massive chamber, unlike anything they had encountered before. The walls curved in impossible angles, covered in black, sinewy material that pulsed as though breathing. In the center, suspended above a pool of shifting energy, was the core. Not a reactor, not machinery, a being. It was unlike anything Aros had seen, a construct of metal and organic mass interwoven, tendrils branching outward, digging into the ship's structure like veins rooting through flesh. Its surface rippled, faces emerging and disappearing, countless expressions lost in a loop of silent torment. Kivos's voice was tight. "This is what the Dominion found." Aros moved forward, rifle trained. "This is what they became." The core pulsed, its presence pressing into the air like a weight against the lungs. Then a voice, or the impression of one, echoed from everywhere and nowhere. "You arrive late," Aros fired. The blast struck center mass, but the impact rippled outward without doing damage, like stone hitting water. The entity barely reacted. "Your kind improvises." The walls groaned. From the edges of the chamber, figures peeled free from the structure, not Dominion soldiers anymore, but something beyond them. Their armor had fused completely with the ship's design, limbs elongated, metal flowing over organic tissue in seamless corruption. Vaith swore. "You'd think just once these things wouldn't have a transformation phase? Less talking, more killing?" Aros snapped, switching to scatter rounds. The new figures moved too fluidly for standard kinetic fire, their bodies shifting mid-motion to evade direct shots. He fired anyway. Dask's voice cut through the channel. "You need to take the core out now. Every second that thing is active, it's integrating more of the fleet into itself." Aros glanced at Kivos. "Options?" The infiltrator had already stripped a data spike from his belt, sinking it with the control panel near the core's suspended mass. I can overload its input feed, force a shutdown, if it follows traditional processing logic. And if it doesn't? Kaivos's jaw tightened. Then we die here. Aros nodded. Do it. The infiltrator slammed the spike into the interface. The chamber convulsed. Not just the walls, but the very air, vibrating with unnatural resonance. The entity above them reacted violently. You misunderstand. A wave of force erupted outward, sending them all staggering. Eros caught himself against the railing, his teeth clenched against the pressure building behind his skull. Kivos struggled to remain standing, his gauntlet flaring with disrupted energy. It's fighting the override. I need more time. Vaith opened fire, his rounds finding their mark but failing to drop the advancing figures. One of the converted soldiers lunged, moving with inhuman speed, its arm elongating into a serrated blade. Aros caught it mid-strike, twisting the limb until it snapped at an unnatural angle. No scream, no pain. It simply adjusted, preparing another attack. They don't break, Vaith muttered, firing another burst. Then we hit them harder, Aros growled. He reached for the last charge pack on his belt, the kind meant to detonate hull breaches. He didn't hesitate. He locked it against the core's base. Kivos, pull back! The infiltrator yanked the data spike free, and the chamber roared in protest. Detonating in 5, Aros warned, keeping his stance firm. Vaith grabbed Kivos and pulled him toward the exit. Aros didn't move. He stared up at the thing that had been waiting for them, the thing the Dominion had called upon without realizing what it truly was. It stared back. You cannot stop what has already begun. Aros let a cold smirk cross his face. Then let's see how well you survive without a heart. He triggered the charge. The chamber imploded. The explosion ripped through the core's structure, sending violent arcs of energy through the entire dreadnought. Aros sprinted for the exit as the walls began collapsing, tendrils retracting violently as the ship itself recoiled. The entity's final words were lost in the chaos. The last thing Aros saw before escaping into the breach point was the core fracturing, its mass splitting apart like shattered glass. Then the ship screamed. The Apex's extraction craft caught them as the dreadnought began to sink, its once formless body twisting in upon itself, collapsing inward. Dask's voice cut through. What the hell just happened? Aros exhaled, watching the horizon as the entity's vessel was reduced to nothing. We ended it before it finished becoming something worse. Othak's voice joined the channel. Fleet's reporting total collapse of Dominion synchronization. Whatever was binding them is gone. Vaith sat back against the bulkhead, breath still ragged. So, we won? Aros didn't answer immediately. He just watched the remnants of the ship sink into oblivion. No, he finally muttered. But we stopped the first step. The dreadnought was gone, its remains scattered in the void like the remnants of an abandoned nightmare. The sky above Drovac 4 still burned with the aftermath, fragments of the Dominion fleet drifting aimlessly, their former cohesion shattered. Whatever force had bound them, whatever unseen grip had twisted their minds into something no longer their own, it had died with the core. But Draven Aros didn't feel relief. He stood at the edge of the Apex's command deck, watching as debris tumbled through the gravitational wake. The battle was over, but the war hadn't ended. Not even close. Vaith leaned beside him, arms crossed, his visor tilted toward the wreckage. You ever get the feeling we just kicked something awake instead of putting it to sleep? Aros exhaled, the weight of the question pressing against the inside of his ribs. We didn't kill it, he admitted. We just made sure it remembered who did this to it. Othak's voice crackled over the secured line. Dominion forces are withdrawing from the outer systems. Whatever control they were under, it's completely severed. They're turning back toward their core worlds. Dask's reply followed a beat later, sharp with skepticism. That's not surrender, that's regrouping. Aros had seen this pattern before. Empires didn't die in a single battle. They recoiled, they adapted, they waited. How long do you think we have? Vaith asked, already knowing the answer. Aros turned from the viewport, his reflection carved against the darkness beyond. Not long enough. There was no celebration in the war room, no raised voices or victory chants. This wasn't the kind of war that ended with one decisive blow. The Dominion had called to something older than them, something waiting beneath the surface of their civilization, like a buried nerve. And now, humanity had made itself known. Kivos was scanning the post-battle reports, his face blank as the feed scrolled across his visor. I ran the data again. That ship, that thing, it didn't just manipulate them. He hesitated as if searching for the right words. It was them. The Dominion didn't just summon something outside themselves. They evolved into it. Dask leaned forward, eyes narrowed. That's not evolution. That's corruption. Call it whatever you want, Kivos said. But if one Dominion fleet could fall to it, that means others can too. That means they'll try again, Aros finished. Somewhere else, with better control, more preparation. Othak's voice remained steady. We crippled their first attempt. Their ability to integrate with it is still unstable. That gives us time to... A warning ping flared across the Apex's heads-up display. Aros turned sharply, watching the incoming data unfold across the screen. The Dominion had retreated, but they weren't the only ones watching. A single transmission had just entered human space. Not from the Dominion, not from any known power. It carried no encryption, no tactical request. Just one message. We saw what you did. We are coming. Vaith let out a slow breath. Friendly, you think? Othak's expression was unreadable. Unknown. Dask's voice carried the weight of something unspoken. They weren't talking to the Dominion, were they? Aros read the message again. It wasn't a threat, not in the conventional sense. It was recognition. A marker placed in history. They were talking to us, Aros confirmed. For years, humanity had watched the stars and wondered if they were alone. Now the answer had arrived. Not in greetings, not in diplomacy, but in blood and fire. Vaith tapped the edge of the display, his tone lighter than the moment deserved. Well, we did want to make an impression. Kivos didn't smile. The kind that gets you erased from history. Aros met his gaze, and for the first time since the war had reignited, he felt it settle into his chest. They had been prey, once. They had been ignored, dismissed, left to die. Now the galaxy knew their name, and that was the only warning humanity would ever give. Aros straightened, turning toward the war table where the next phase was already being drawn up. Let them come. Dask folded his arms, considering the looming storm ahead. You really think we can hold them off? Aros didn't answer immediately. He looked at the wreckage beyond the viewport, at the remnants of what had tried to consume them. Then he spoke, voice calm, certain. I think they don't understand what they just started.